Now, sometimes I really do feel like I'm in the minority when I say that I firmly believe that Star Wars is, for the most part, a pretty well written franchise. But there is one area where I really feel like both George Lucas and Disney have dropped the ball completely, and that would have to be the depiction of the Separatists.
Don't leave me.
While every era of Star Wars can ultimately be boiled down to a fight of good versus evil, the premise of the Clone Wars is, at least theoretically, a little more complex. The opening title crawl reads, "There are heroes on both sides, evil is everywhere." At the end of the day, every combatant across the entire war is an unknowing pawn of Palpatine. But despite this, the vast majority of Clone Wars era content frames the Separatists as mustache-twirling villains, and the vast majority of Republic characters are heroic and just. Now, I do want to make it clear from the start that I'm not under the impression that the Separatists should actually be treated as heroes across the board. As much as I love to play the role of Dooku apologist, his methods clearly land him in a villainous role, and the Separatist military leadership is morally reprehensible basically across the board. Characters like Wat Tambor and Admiral Trench shouldn't be treated like they have a great deal of moral nuance, in the same way that Tarkin and Pong Krell aren't morally nuanced even when they're fighting for the Republic. What I really have a problem with is the lack of stories focusing on the Separatists in any capacity outside of being a foil to the Republic characters. They are a fully fledged section of the galaxy. They have their own goals, their own motivations, their own legitimate grievances with the Republic, and their own cultures. Did you know, for example, that the capital of the Confederacy was Raxus for the entire duration of the war? Now, if you haven't heard of Raxus, that's because Clone Wars has 133 episodes. Now, would you like to guess how many episodes Raxus appears in? You may be surprised to hear that it's one episode. Literally one episode. This is a war between two major factions. Raxus appears in one episode? That one episode was part of the Heroes on Both Sides arc, which depicted a Separatist senator and her quest for peace. It touched on the idea that most Separatists were actually pretty decent people, again with legitimate grievances against the Republic. They didn't want the war any more than the citizens of the Republic did. These themes should be central components of the entire era, but this is pretty much the only time the subject is explored in any detail, and this is an issue that's mostly unique to the Separatists. I don't need to tell you how many stories are written from the perspective of the Galactic Republic, and attention is split pretty evenly between the Rebels and the Empire. The writers of Star Wars aren't afraid to depict rebels that clearly take things too far, like Saw Gerrera, or Imperials with redeeming traits, like Yularen or Thrawn. And I'll give Disney more time to write sequel-era content before I bring those factions into the conversation. But for now, out of the four major factions that have been around for decades and have had plenty of time to be written properly, the Separatists are by far the least fleshed out. Sometimes, it even feels like the Star Wars writers are eager to wash their hands of the faction entirely. One particularly interesting Rebel storyline has the Spectre Cell traveling to Geonosis, where they realize that the entire population has been genocided by the Empire to tie up loose ends. But once they begin to explore the hives, they find one surviving Geonosian, carrying a queen egg that will eventually hatch and repopulate the planet. I found this to be a very interesting concept. It allows the Geonosians a bit of a fresh start, distancing them from the atrocities of the war and allowing writers in the future to write new and interesting stories featuring one of the prequel era's most recognizable aliens. Except when the Queen hatched and did make an appearance in the Darth Vader comic run, some boneheaded writer had decided to arbitrarily make her sterile, seemingly just to prevent the species from ever appearing in any more stories. Now, this seems like a bit of a spiteful thing to do, and I personally failed to see any benefit to this decision, and I, if you can't tell, find it infuriating.
I can feel your anger. It gives you focus, makes you stronger.
What's weird is that even though Star Wars keeps the Separatists at arm's length, they seem to have no qualms about occasionally vaguely hinting at the idea that most of them probably had a point. Anakin and Padme are seen arguing about the idea that they may be fighting for the wrong side in the war.
And you're sounding like a Separatist.
And characters like Cassian Andor, who grew up fighting for the Separatist cause, pretty seamlessly carry on that fight under the banner of the Rebel Alliance, moving from villain to hero without ever changing their methods or their cause. Another episode of Rebels has Rex fighting in a simulated final Clone Wars battle against a tactical droid who refused the shutdown order, only for them to unite at the end of the episode against the greater evil, the Empire. Even Count Dooku has received a lot more attention in Tales of the Jedi, depicting his moral nuance in the earlier years of his fall from grace, and the High Republic hints at the lack of care given to the Outer Rim, hundreds of years before that particular pressure point helps ignite the war. And even Bad Batch, though I didn't particularly love it, did an excellent job depicting that the clones aren't inherently heroic. Though a noticeable fraction of the clones rebelled against the Empire, that sentiment was one imparted in them by the Jedi that led them, not something they were born with. Good soldiers follow orders, and the vast majority of clones became an extension of the Empire's will just as easily as they had mirrored the Jedi's heroism during the war. Now, I want to repeat that I'm not currently attempting to make the case that the Separatist cause was completely pure. I'm just pointing out that if neither side was morally in the right, why is one treated like a golden child and the other so prone to compulsive, nonsensical mustache twirling the second it appears on camera? I mean, even the battle droids are played off as comedy relief half the time. Would it really hurt to tell some stories from the perspective of the Separatists during and after the war, instead of just hinting at their sympathetic traits and occasionally name-dropping Count Dooku?
And I won't give up to you.
You're a Separatist.
Separatist is a pejorative term. I support democracy. Count Dooku was a visionary. He was cut short in his prime by the Jedi enforcers.
I mean, the bare minimum you could do is not rudely scribble all over the rest of the page once you're done writing your sentence, just to make sure that nobody can ever add to that story again. It's not like there aren't good stories you can tell. How about a Grievous origin story, or dive into the political scene of Sereno and Raxus during the war? I mean, pretty much anything you do on those two planets will be adding to the Separatist world building, considering you never see either of them, despite their supposed importance. Or tell a story from the perspective of a Separatist holdout after the war, attempting to escape the Empire. Breathe a little bit of nuance back into Count Dooku's character and shed light on his vision of the galaxy post-war, since it's never really made clear exactly what his vision is. Emphasize the unspoken connection between the Separatists and the Rebel Alliance. But above all else, it doesn't have to be major, just tell stories about these worlds and these characters. Stop using them as just caricatures in the background of your stories about the supposedly heroic factions and start fleshing them out a little bit, properly.